Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, let me welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. In today's session, we shall be engaging with Restoration drama. Restoration drama, as we have noted before, it's perhaps the most notable artistic production of the period, and it's also the best known of the period. So as we begin, let's take a quick look at the shifting literary trends in English theatre from the Elizabethan times onwards. We have also noticed through a discussion of the socio-political background that framed particular literary and artistic tendencies that most of these shifting tendencies and these shifting loyalties were also largely dependent on whoever was the country's ruler at particular points of time. And we also noticed that whoever was in power also controlled all kinds of laws, morality, fashion, and also dictated what was popular and acceptable for each period. In that sense, we see a transition from the Elizabethan times onwards. For instance, Queen Elizabeth I, she loved theatre and promoted all kinds of arts. We so also find theatre flourishing during this time. James I, he continues to promote art and literature. With Charles I, he never was against the promotion of art and literature. We also find a sense of Jacobean drama continuing to exist during that time. But also there is a significant decline that ensues during this time because of the various struggles of the monarch with the parliament, the civil war that followed, the beheading of the king, and we also find the Commonwealth getting created under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. And under his rule, we also find that the theatre activity had completely closed down with the closure of theatres in 1642. And the Puritan government also had put an end to all kinds of entertainment in England during that point of time. With the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, with the Charles II assuming the throne of England, we also find theatres getting rebuilt, the acting companies are reinstated, and entertainment becomes stronger than ever. And there is also a predominant French influence which begins to dictate the fashion of the period, the literary tendencies of the period. And we also notice that Charles II, and with the restoration of the theatre, there is a certain kind of prolific production of drama and all kinds of art forms, especially after the suppression of a little more than a decade. So we do find that this England after restoration, it begins on a fresh note, and although not altogether accepted by all the historians and all the critics of the time, but we also find that a new phase gets inaugurated in terms of drama. So this phase also comes into being after the dearth of theatrical productions from 1642 to 1660. So in that sense, drama after the event of the restoration of Stuart dynasty, we also find an inevitable reaction against the Puritan manners and morals. So there is also certain significant things that happened during this time. It's characterized by the return of the Cavaliers, the supporters of the Royalists primarily. They were exiled in France and they returned, and as Hudson notes it, with their return there was a different kind of moral ambience which was getting generated in England. They encouraged hedonistic liveliness, infidelity and profligacy became fashionable, moral ideals turned into jest, and domestic virtue was ridiculed. So this was the moral and social scene in London, in England, particularly in London after the return of the Cavaliers from the exile. And the court of Charles II also promoted all of these vices, and allow me to read a passage from Hudson. Hudson describes the court of Charles II as the most shameless ever known. He goes on to say, "It was the scene of much pleasure, liberty and scandal, and the centre of patronage for politics, fashion, literature, art, learning, invention, company promoting, and 100 other activities of the king's eager subjects seeking notoriety or reward." So this was the scene in the court of Charles II. This also provokes us to take a look at the kind of life Charles II was leading. He is generally known as the merry monarch of England. On a lighter note, many historians also feel that he was the one who brought back partying to England, and he promoted liveliness and hedonism in his court. and his lifestyle was also quite promiscuous, and we find that he had at least 12 illegitimate children through various mistresses, and all of these licenses were not considered very acceptable either, and he had no legal heir incidentally. And he was the one who granted the theatre licenses in England, and he also with the dictum required that the female parts be played by their natural performers, women themselves, and not by adolescent boys, as it used to happen in the Elizabethan and the Jacobean times. So a lot of change had already begun with the restoration of Charles II. At this point, we cannot begin our discussion without taking a look at who comprised the court wits. Court wits were a set of people who were part and parcel of Charles II's court. They were primarily poets and dramatists, and they were also gentlemen amateurs, and they had their own kinds of amusements, and they also used to amuse Charles II incredibly. And very often it was said about them that they were their own first audience, so they did not really write for the public or for the commoners, unlike the earlier writers and artists, but they performed only for their own kind in front of their friends, in front of the court, and most of these performances were not made public either. And they were also patrons of humbler writers who existed in England during that time. And the most important of the court wit was John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester. He was considered as a wit and a rake of the first order, and he was also considered as a leader of the court wits. In fact, much of Restoration comedy, it was modelled on this character of Rochester, who is said to have caught the fancy of many during those times. The other important court wits were George Villiers, Charles Sackville, Sir Charles Sedley, John Sheffield, Sir Carr Scrope, Sir George Etheridge, and William Wycherley. A couple of them we shall come back to take a look at when we talk about Restoration comedy. They otherwise dominated the cultural scene of London to such an extent that it was not possible to talk about entertainment without having a reference to these court wits. And these court wits, because of the lavish lifestyle and the extravagant lifestyle that they enjoyed, and also because of the popularity and rather the notoriety that they had in London, they continued to appear in many of their own plays, or even many of the other plays were also modelled on the real life characters of these court wits. So this was not seen as a bad thing by them. They also kind of enjoyed this kind of popularity, or rather the notoriety that they had in London at the point of time. And because of these varied reasons, some historians, for instance Hudson, he is of the opinion that one need not give much space to this part of our subject, and his argument being the theatre was now almost wholly the creature of the demoralized world of fashions, and it everywhere reflected the taste of its patrons. For this reasons, many historians during those times as well as the later times, they do not feel it quite appropriate to include these theatrical activities into the literary history, because it also included a history of the amorous adventures and the sexual adventures that most of these court wits had. Having said that, Hudson briefly talks about the Restoration, the comedy of the Restoration period, and he only makes a very brief mention in a couple of paragraphs about William Wycherley and his work The Country Wife, William Congreve, Sir John Vanbrugh, George Farquhar. So other than that, we do not find a prolific discussion of the Restoration drama in Hudson, or in for that matter in most of the leading early historical writings. So the Restoration drama in general, it was characterized by an open and unabashed indecency. It also revealed the spirit of the society for whose amusement it was produced. So maybe this was a result of the continued repression and suppression of the decade-old rule under the Puritan government led by Oliver Cromwell. It is not to say that this kind of drama was free from criticisms. Even during those times, it drew a lot of flack, a lot of criticism from eminent people of those times. The most important one being the tremendous castigation that it received from Reverend Jeremy Collier. He published a short view of the profaneness and immorality of the English stage in 1698, and this work, it was an immense sensation, and it had a salutary effect in England then. It was also instrumental in rousing public opinion against such kind of theatre which displayed and celebrated indecency and unabashed immorality. So this work by Reverend Collier, it also condemned the mockery of the clergy in these comedies. It also condemned the kind of lopsided portrayal of the upper class lifestyle, and also it objected the sexual innuendos and the profanity which was quite dominant and also enjoyed by the people of the times. And he makes this observation in his writing right at the outset. Being convinced that nothing has gone farther in debauching the age than the stage poets and playhouse, I thought I could not employ my time better than in writing against them. So, this plea was not unnoticed. In fact, the result was that a royal order prohibiting the acting of anything contrary to religion and good manners was issued shortly. But however, censorship became an official policy only after about 4 decades. In spite of these many criticisms against restoration drama and restoration comedy in particular, modern critics also consider that this entire field and this entire genre is a critic's chimera. There are a lot of recent works which have begun to take a look at the private lives of these court wits and also the writers of the restoration comedy, and to try and understand the kind of drama that they produced and the effect that it had on the restoration society, particularly the early period of Charles II's rule. Moving on, let's take a quick look at what constituted restoration theatre. It was a very different audience that went to watch these plays. It was mostly upper class. It was not the kind of plays that were enjoyed by the Elizabethan and the Jacobean audience. And the theatre was also quite modern in the sense that there was the presence of a lot of modern props, such as the modern picture frame stage. Actresses were part of it, not just actors. There was the presence of movable scenery, artificial lightings. If you remember, in the Elizabethan and the Jacobean times, one could not stage a play after sundown, or one required candles, which was rather expensive. Theatre also moves indoors from the outdoor public playhouses. This was primarily to cater to the elite, and these were also private theatres, not public playhouses like the Elizabethan and the Jacobean times. The 2 major licensed theatres in London during those times were the Theatre Royal and the Duke's House. And these were also, let me reiterate, theatres indoor catered to the elite courtiers. It's not to say that Shakespeare and Marlowe had completely gone out of fashion. We also find a lot of adaptations by Shakespeare and Marlowe during this time. Many of their plays were also adapted to suit contemporary tastes and political needs. It was we also notice the influence of Ben Jonson considerably, especially in the comedy of humours, which make a comeback during this period as well. We find that with the interest displayed also on the comedy of manners, there is an emphasis on social acceptability as well. Plays are also staged and adapted in order to suit and to this sort of acceptability. For instance, there is this particular adaptation made by Nahum Tate, which was a reworking of King Lear by Shakespeare. We find that the play had a happy ending, contrary to Shakespeare's original play. Also, the violent, gory scene, which included the blinding of Gloucester, was completely removed in order to save the agony of the present viewers. We also notice that the restoration comedy reflected not the real social world, but the ideal social world of the court wits of Charles II. And this was also a sort of a halfway house between Elizabethan theatre and the theatre of the early 19th and early 20th century. We do not find a complete break from the Elizabethan and Jacobean period. For example, as we noted, a strong influence of Ben Jonson continues to prevail, and also there is this typical restoration wit combat between the sexes, which was modelled on some of Ben Jonson's comedy of manners as well. So, in spite of all of these things which were built into the theatre of the Restoration period, we find that it was mostly catering to the taste of an upper class court wit audience, and also we find significantly an admiration and imitation of French wit. If you remember, French taste dominated the European scene as well, but in spite of this predominant influence of the French in the Restoration drama, we find that it's also inherently English. This kind of drama also promoted a pseudo courtly ideal in England, particularly focused in London, and this is in stark contrast with the knightly code that existed in the works of Spenser and Sidney, and in that sense it also promoted the kind of lives and the lifestyle that were enjoyed by the court wits of the time. As we noted with the dictum of Charles II, women were allowed to play a part on the stage, but they got lesser wages than that of men. And many of the male actors of the times of those time, we also notice that they become playwrights as well, but we do not find this transition happening in many women. There's only a couple of names which are mentioned, especially that of Charlotte Clark, who was an actress, and she is said to have written 3 plays. There was very little dramatic activity outside London, and the playhouses which existed during that time, the private playhouses, they were seen as the center of vice and exhibitionism, and it was also seen as a place which had to be avoided by respectable citizens of the time. And there was no relation to the real world of England during the time. It was a very ideal kind of a world that the court wits enjoyed to have, and in that sense it was also a world of wish fulfillment, and it was also the world which focused on creating an ideal wit and an ideal rake, nothing of the knightly code or the knightly conduct of the Spencerian and the earlier Elizabethan times. This perhaps of all of these reasons put together, this kind of drama had a very short-lived effect with no lasting impact on literature. We also find that this more than the positive things, it had done more harm, particularly because there was a hostile kind of attitude that developed in England, at least for a while, and it was also considered that well brought up young people were not supposed to visit these sort of playhouses or to engage with this kind of drama. So, coming to talk about the particular kinds of genres of drama that existed in England during that time, the most important one was Restoration comedy. So, Restoration comedy was no different from the kind of things that the court wits promoted. It promoted amoral wit and stylized hedonism. It was confined to London. In that sense, it was a very metropolitan kind of drama and literature. It had no relation or any kind of relatability to the provincial cultures, and it was also not popular outside London. And we also find in most of these plays there is an universal kind of praise being showered on the city of London, and also the people who are from outside the city of London, they are also ridiculed, and there is also pronounced detestation of the countryside. And we find in these plays, at least in most of these plays, a portrayal of marriage as an institution quite boring and restrictive, and it also highlights and even celebrates the carnality, follies and vices which exist outside the institution of marriage. And there is also a celebration of adultery, sexual attraction, and also sexual conquest, which was considered quite a commendable quality for a rake. In terms of the technicalities, there was also a presence of a set scenes which were quite parodied in most of the plays of those times. The supreme example was that of a proviso scene. A proviso scene included a definite set of rules in order to facilitate a balanced relationship or a dialogue through which a kind of setting of parameters was done in terms of having an equal marriage. So, this was primarily a discussion between the couple in order to bring about a certain kind of a balance in their relationships. We find this sort of proviso scenes being part of most of the dominant Restoration comedy of those times. The other significant features included the quick wit, repartee, intrigue. There was a lot of local gossip also built into these plays, and the plays also had very intricate parallel plots, and this also was because these playwrights like to challenge the courtly audience, the upper class elite audience. There was also an element of farce. We find trace of the comedy of manners. There was social satire built in, and we also noticed that humor in the comedies were mostly of provincial nature. So, it was more local, and it failed to make sense outside the immediate circles. Who were the most important people of the Restoration comedy? The big five of the Restoration comedy were George Etheridge and William Wycherley, who were also court wits, William Congreve, George Farquhar, and John Vanbrugh. And George Farquhar was incidentally the only professional playwright. The others mostly wrote for their fashionable and friendly circles. Let's take a very brief look at each of these plays. George Etheridge, he engaged with the themes of love and intrigue and also of vanity. And he also tried to build into his plot structure a lot of details related to amorous adventures of the protagonist. And one of his famous plays was titled She Would If She Could. This was staged in 1688, and it was a huge success. There is this particular lady protagonist, Lady Cockwood, who was characterized as an amorous lady who pursues the hero. In Pepper's diary, it was noted that at least 1,000 people were turned away for lack of adequate seats on the opening night of this play, She Would If She Could. So, this was a kind of popularity that Restoration comedy enjoyed during that time. And the another significant play of Etheridge was Man of Mode in 1676, an earlier one. In this, there is this particular character of Sir Fopling Futter. This character is considered as a prototype of the dandy who was to become very popular in the European stage at a later point of time. In terms of the names of the characters used, we would find that there are these interesting coinages that most of the dramatists continue to use during their time. It was also considered as an instant hit in terms of these peculiar names that were given to the characters in the play. The second most important playwright of this period was William Congreve. His important plays were The Old Bachelor, The Double Dealer and Love for Love, and also the most successful one was The Way of the World. Most of his works, they included brilliant dialogues, and he also relied on set characters and themes. But in spite of these predictability which was associated with most of his plays, he also displayed an exemplary sense of dramatic craft. And there's also this critique against Congreve's plays that the witty conversations in his works were so engaging that they almost overshadowed the movement of the plot as well. A Way of the World was one of the most successful plays of Congreve, and also perhaps the most one of the most important plays of the period as well. Staged in 1700, it was about the love relationship between this couple, Millamant and Mirabell. The dialogue between this couple, it was considered as a very good example of the proviso scene which was dominant in the Restoration comedy. This was about the theme of bargaining between the sexes prior to marriage. This was hugely enjoyed at that point of time and continued to catch the fancy of the people even at a later point of time. In most of his works, we find that Congreve was more concerned with form and dramatic structure than with theme, and we also find that his characters were overdone and unidimensional in nature, so they failed to appeal to a larger audience outside his circles or outside the age in which this drama was popular. And apart from the many limitations that Congreve's plays had, we find that the portrait of villains and other lowly characters were more commendable than that of the protagonists in most of his works. William Wycherley was perhaps the most noted in terms of dramatic genius and technique. Even Hudson makes a notable and worthy mention of Wycherley in his literary history. His works mostly focused on women's hypocrisy, and also there was this limitation that many of the portraits even were on the verge of being a farce. His plays were considered unacceptable in terms of the kind of dialogues and the kind of themes that it included. It especially had a lot of innuendos, a lot of double entendres. It was a phrase open to two interpretations, one predominantly sexual in nature, and there were also these lengthy asides which spoke about many things related to sexuality, about things which were taboo during those times, and also about the relationship between men and women. Country Wife was the most successful play of Wycherley. This was also considered, and it continues to be considered, as the typical Restoration comedy which celebrated amoral activities. It spoke about seduction and hypocrisy as well. In this play, The Country Wife, we find that a particular character named Honor, and his activities are lauded with a lot of humor. And this in this play, this character who pretends to be a eunuch, he secures admission to private spaces where women are, and he manages to seduce a lot of women. And this is considered as a commendable kind of quality, and the play continued to celebrate this sort of quality, so to speak, which was present in this protagonist. And there's also this portrayal of Mrs. Pinchwife, who claims to be innocent but also falls as prey to the advances of this protagonist, and also ends up cheating her husband. And we find that most of these characters were archetypes in Restoration comedy, and we find them getting repeated in many of the plays at a later point as well. Talking about this play in particular, The Country Wife, Trevelyan makes this very interesting remark. In no other age would such a plot motive have appealed to any English audience. So at a later point, many historians were even quite in awe with the fact that this sort of comedy and this sort of theme structure and plot structure, one after the other, that it continued to enthrall an audience which was otherwise not in encouragement of such kind of plot structure or such kind of thematic things. And at least this was the opinion of most of the dominant historians and literary historians of a later point. The other significant work by Wycherley was The Plain Dealer. And moving on, let's take a look at the dominant works of John Vanbrugh. He was an important figure, in the sense that he mostly reworked plays from the Spanish and French plays. His significant plays were The Relapse and The Provoked Wife. His work had rich characters. It was also built with body comedy. There was crude wit. There was also an overwhelming cynicism of all these kinds of things which were happening around, and he also caricatured marital troubles in his play. In fact, because of the bawdiness and because of the bold language which was part of Vanbrugh's plays, we find Jeremy Collier singling out Vanbrugh in his treatise against the immorality of the stage, and in that sense he also had a lot of public appeal during that time, and also was quite an eyesore in the sight of many like Jeremy Collier. George Farquhar, another significant writer of the time, he had written 7 comedies and a farce. He also believed very staunchly that a play without a cuckold, a beau or a coquette was poor entertainment. So we can almost imagine the kind of plot structure which he celebrated in most of his plays. His important works were The Recruiting Officer, in which he satirizes the way in which class dominates over affections and even relationships, and The Twin Rivals, in which a younger brother almost steals his older brother's title and estate. And the other significant work was The Beau Stratagem. And we also find that his drama, it serves as a bridge between Restoration drama and the later 17th century drama of sentiment. And moving on, it's important to highlight the presence of Afra Ben here as well. She was perhaps the only and the most successful women playwright of the times. Her important comedies were The Dutch Lover and The Rover. She was criticized for her unfeminine themes and portraits, and obviously for her unfeminine kind of lifestyle and unconventional lifestyle that she led during those times. Afra Ben was very popular with the theatre enthusiasts of those times, and she was incidentally the first woman to earn her life by writing for the theatre. In that sense, the first professional successful playwright of those times. And in her plays, there were a lot of sharp critiques of masculinity and power. She also highlighted the unequal education opportunities which women received during that age. In her play, The Widow Ranter, we find the theme of colonization coming back, just like her fiction, Orunoko, which we took a look at in the previous session. So she continued to be a strong critique of the colonization and also about the patriarchal system of the period, and we also find a sense of seriousness getting built into her comedies, unlike the Restoration comedy written mostly by the male dramatists. If we look at Restoration tragedy, it was equally artificial, and also it was not very fashionable because the wealthy elites did not enjoy the tragedy much. They enjoyed only the comedy of the times. And the important works were Dryden's All for Love, based on Antony and Cleopatra, and Congreve's The Mourning Bride. We also find a couple of writers such as Nathaniel Lee, Thomas Otway, etc., also staging tragedies over there, but they were not hugely popular, and most of these works, they were primarily done for the stage, and they had very little value as literature. We do not even find them getting adequate attention at a later point. And looking at the elements of Restoration tragedy, it's important to note that it never achieved the same stature or literary perfection as that of Restoration comedy. It was not popular then. It never regained popularity at a later point either. Heroic drama was the most common kind of representation during those times, and heroic tragedy, as it was depicted in the Restoration period, it was primarily the conflict between love and honor or between love and duty. And we also note that there was no place for heroic virtues given the kind of decadence of the times, and also about the prolific kind of presence of celebration of vice in the Restoration comedy of those times. We find that there was no place for heroic virtues at all in the tragedy. Some critics even talk about this age as an unheroic age, and the concept of heroism itself was very limited and artificial, and it was also quite an inflated and exaggerated kind of representation. Tragedy, unlike the Elizabethan and the Jacobean concepts and representation, tragedy in Restoration drama was the result of failure and not the result of an overarching ambition. We also find an excessive use of melodrama and histrionics taking a dominant place in the tragedy of the Restoration time. There was also a limited concern with social stability, which do not get much attention due to the flawed thematic structure or due to the unimpressive kind of presentation of these drama. We find Dryden coming up with this particular essay on heroic plays in order to defend the tragedies written during those times. He also defended the extravagance of action in these works. But apart from the kind of effective defense that it could put up during those times, Dryden's work was more noted as a a notable work of literary criticism and a major contribution towards the growth of literary criticism at a later point of time. Perhaps the most important dramatist of Restoration tragedy was Dryden himself. He composed quite a few plays of tragedy which were also considered important even at a later point of time. Tyrannic Love or the Royal Martyr in 1669, The Conquest of Granada, which had two parts. It was also about a national strife that England had encountered during those times. All for Love is perhaps the most successful of his writings and also perhaps the most successful tragedy of those times. This was adapted from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Its popularity continued even into the 19th century. The other important tragedy that he produced was The Indian Queen. The other significant playwrights of the period who focused more on tragedy were Thomas Otway. His works included The Orphan and The Venice Preserved. Nicholas Rowe wrote 7 tragedies altogether, including The Ambitious Stepmother, Tamlane and The Fair Penitent. And some of his characters were also said to have inspired the later novelists, particularly Samuel Richardson's The Character of Lovelace in his novel Clarissa, and Henry Fielding's Miss Matthews in his novel Amelia. They were said to have inspired by some of the characters portrayed by Nicholas Rowe. Rowe also had a particular set of writings later termed as Shri tragedies. Two prominent of them were Jane Shore and Lady Jane. It included vivid descriptions of female distress. The popularity and significance of these plays were, however, heavily overshadowed by the presence of the Restoration comedy, which was enjoyed by the people and also promoted hugely by the court of Charles II. Nathaniel Lee was another significant writer who also had collaborated with Dryden. With this, we come to almost the end of this session. It's also at the time to make a quick evaluation of Restoration drama and also figure out what happened after that. This sort of celebration of the profligacy and vices of the time, also the kind of unacceptability that the Restoration comedy had, it was only the beginning of a decline which went on until about the early 18th century. And we also find that during this period, the people's attention turned to fictional prose rather than drama. And also many feel that perhaps this sort of repetitiveness in theme and plot and also this predictability in terms of the comedy, people were also quite fed up with this sort of repeated performances. And the attack on the immorality of the stage, it also had a profound influence on the people, and we also find them continually attacking the Restoration comedy which was prevalent. And another important point was that since it was mostly a metropolitan kind of literature and without any kind of a provincial element built into it, we do not find the whole of England supporting the sort of plays which were prominent in Restoration drama. In fact, plays were performed, let me reiterate, only in London, and the rest of England was completely left out from this form of drama. So in that sense, it could not even be called as a national kind of literature or a national kind of drama during the Restoration period. With the Theatre Licensing Act of 1737, we also find that this sort of dramatic activity also comes to an end. Lord Chamberlain, who was appointed as the official government censor, he came up with this act, and it also had the power to grant or refuse license to any play on religious, moral or political grounds. So with this, we also find Restoration drama in certain ways, particularly the Restoration comedy, coming to an end. But however, it's of supreme importance to note the kind of dramatic activity which happened after the Restoration, and particularly after the reopening of the theatres during the time of the Restoration. So with this, we come to an end of this session. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.